So when you look at a heavily fortified medieval castle from the outside, the architecture forces a very specific assumption about the people inside.
Right, it's entirely defensive.
Exactly. You see these massive, impenetrable stone walls, uh, the heavy iron portcullises, arrow slits instead of windows. The whole visual language is just, rigid and cold.
Yeah, and the architecture is literally doing its job. It's projecting this exclusionary barrier.
Right. And it's so natural to assume that the society operating behind those walls must be equally austere. Like they must be locked in a perpetual state of fear, just completely cut off from the warmth of the open world.
Most people just walk past those walls, feel the chill, and never actually ask what the barrier is shielding.
But imagine you somehow get the key. You pull open those heavy wooden gates, stepping into the courtyard, and you're fully bracing yourself for, silence and rigid discipline.
But that's not what's in there.
No, not at all. Instead, you're instantly hit by this wall of sound and heat. It's a massive, ecstatic celebration.
Thousands of people.
Thousands, singing at the top of their lungs, moving together in this surging dance, tables groaning under shared feasts, and the air is just vibrating with these soaring melodies.
It's an incredible image.
And the realization hits you instantly, right? Those stone walls were never built to lock people in a cold prison. They were built to act as a furnace.
A furnace. I like that.
Yeah, they exist to protect a very specific, incredibly intense fire burning right in the center of the courtyard, keeping the outside winds from blowing it out.
And that completely flips the outside perception on its head. I mean, most people only ever interact with the exterior walls of Hasidic Judaism.
Right, the distinct black coats, the isolated neighborhoods.
Exactly, the strict adherence to ancient laws. But the materials provided for today's deep dive ask us to basically ignore that outsider's assumption and look directly at the fire inside.
Which is an incredibly ambitious mission for us today. We are taking this highly customized stack of research on Hasidic Judaism, which was specifically tailored for you, the listener, and we're looking for the internal logic.
We really want to explore the central paradox of this movement.
Yeah, like how does a religious system known globally for enforcing some of the strictest traditional boundaries in the modern world also serve as a vessel for ecstatic joy?
And deep emotional vulnerability.
Yes. And the radical democratization of mysticism. It's fascinating.
To understand that paradox, we have to look at the psychological and spiritual mechanics of the tradition. We aren't just going to recount a timeline.
Right. No dry history lessons here.
We're going to deconstruct the believer's mindset. We need to look at this from the inside out. Mapping the exact mechanisms that make this incredibly demanding system profoundly meaningful for the people living within it.
And looking at the framing for this research, you, the listener, actually pinpointed a very specific aesthetic for this deep dive.
The notes mention a vibe of sacred mystery and quiet wisdom, right?
Exactly. There's a direct connection drawn here to a subpersonality concept you work with called Tira, and a specific soundtrack titled Tira's Diary.
So the underlying theme seems to be about finding stabilizing wisdom in places that seem inherently mysterious or veiled.
Spot on. So we're taking that lens, that search for internal stabilizing truth, and applying it to a historical movement that was literally born out of destabilization and chaos.
Which is really the only place we can start. I mean, if we want to understand this intense, mandated focus on joy in modern Hasidism, we have to look at the sheer historical despair of 18th century Eastern Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The regions we're talking about, modern-day Ukraine, Poland, those surrounding areas, were just an absolute crucible of suffering for Jewish communities in the mid-1700s.
The physical and economic realities were just brutal.
Brutal is the word. You have waves of violent, organized pogroms ripping through towns, leaving total devastation. Plus, intense political instability as borders shifted and empires clashed.
And layered on top of all that constant physical danger is a widespread, crushing poverty.
Yeah, people were literally fighting just to keep their families from starving in the mud.
So the baseline human experience in that time and place was trauma, but the sources highlight an additional, arguably more insidious layer of suffering.
Oh, the internal stuff.
Right, occurring internally within the Jewish community itself.
Yeah.
And that was a profound, systemic, spiritual disenfranchisement.
This is a fascinating dynamic to unpack, because in an environment where everyone is suffering physically, the internal social structures often become more rigid, don't they?
They absolutely do. Traditional Jewish life at this time had developed a hyper-focus on one specific, highly exclusive metric of human worth.
Elite Talmudic scholarship.
Exactly. And the Talmud is this vast, incredibly dense compendium of Jewish law, philosophy, and theology.
Engaging with it requires years of intense study.
Years. You need mastery of complex Aramaic and Hebrew and a highly analytical mind.
But it also requires something far more practical, which is time and money.
Right, which most people didn't have.
I mean, if you're a shoemaker or a tailor or a water carrier working from dawn until dusk just to afford a loaf of bread, you fundamentally do not have the bandwidth to sit in a study hall debating religious law.
Consequently, an academic hierarchy emerged that functioned almost like a spiritual caste system.
The scholars were the spiritual elites.
Yes, they were viewed as the ones closest to the divine because they were mastering the divine law.
Which means if you weren't a scholar, you were spiritually sidelined. You were basically told that your connection to God was secondary.
Mediated and less valuable.
Imagine the psychological devastation of that. You're hunted by the outside world, you're starving in your own home, and when you turn to your religion for solace, the leadership tells you that you aren't educated enough to matter to God.
It's bleak.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. It sounds like back then, spiritual closeness was locked behind an academic paywall.
That is a perfect way to put it. A completely rigid gatekeeping of the divine.
And into this landscape of profound physical poverty and emotional alienation steps a figure who fundamentally alters Jewish history.
Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer. He lived from roughly 1700 to 1760.
Better known as the Baal Shem Tov.
Right, which translates to the master of the good name.
So the Baal Shem Tov looks at this heavily gate-kept spiritual economy, and he introduces a concept that acts as a theological earthquake.
He teaches that every single Jew, no matter how simple or uneducated, has the capacity for direct, unmediated closeness to God.
He takes the deepest, most profound connections to the divine, and he essentially made mysticism open source.
He bypasses the intellect entirely.
Wow.
He tells the illiterate tavern keeper or the exhausted farmer that a simple, sincere prayer recited with a broken heart is infinitely more powerful than the most brilliant, emotionally detached intellectual argument.
He validates the spiritual lives of the masses. He gives them back their dignity.
Suddenly, the currency of the divine realm isn't academic pedigree.
It's emotional sincerity.
Exactly. But whenever you dismantle a power structure, the people sitting at the top are going to perceive it as an existential threat.
Of course, the traditional Jewish leadership, the scholarly elites, they reacted to this open source mysticism with absolute alarm.
The notes refer to these critics as the mitnickdim, the opponents.
And this wasn't just a mild academic disagreement, was it?
No, this was a fierce, bitter conflict, spearheaded by incredibly brilliant figures like the Vilna Gaon.
I want to look closely at the mechanics of this opposition. Was the Vilna Gaon just a jealous gatekeeper trying to protect his social status? Or was there a deeper structural fear driving the mitnickdim?
It was overwhelmingly a structural fear. From the perspective of the traditionalists, they weren't just protecting their egos.
They thought they were protecting Judaism itself.
Exactly. The sources break down their fears into a few key areas. First, they were terrified of this new emphasis on mysticism and intense emotionalism.
Because emotion is inherently volatile. It doesn't obey the rules of logic or law.
Precisely. Jewish survival up to that point relied on a rigorous, unyielding adherence to the law, halakha.
The law was the anchor.
Yes. So if you suddenly tell thousands of uneducated, traumatized people that their ecstatic emotions are more important than studying the law, the traditionalists feared a complete descent into anarchy.
They worried people would abandon the commandments entirely in pursuit of a spiritual high.
Right.
The gatekeepers genuinely believed that without the gates, the city would be sacked. I mean, if anyone can talk to God, who decides what God is saying?
And that leads to their second major fear, the destruction of scholarly authority.
Because if the illiterate tailor is on the same spiritual footing as the master scholar, the entire foundation of rabbinic authority crumbles.
The system that had held the Jewish people together through centuries of exile was suddenly being undermined from within.
But the irony here, as the sources emphasize, is that the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, the Hasidim, did not see themselves as rebels destroying the system.
No, they vehemently rejected the idea that they were inventing a new religion or abandoning the law.
What's fascinating here is that, from their internal perspective, they were performing a rescue operation.
They believed the intellectualism of the elites had become a dry, lifeless shell. They were reviving the beating heart of the tradition.
And they didn't just invent this emotional framework out of thin air, right?
Not at all. The notes make it clear that they drew heavily on established, highly complex, older traditions.
Specifically, pulling from 16th century Kabbalah, primarily the teachings of Isaac Luria.
They took these incredibly esoteric, elite, mystical concepts and translated them into a folk spirituality that the common person could utilize.
It was a masterful synthesis. They combined the profound depths of Lurianic Kabbalah with the everyday realities of Eastern European Jewish life.
And despite the excommunications, the book burnings, and the fierce opposition from the Mitnagdim, the movement did not fracture and die.
No. After the Baal Shem Tov's passing, his disciples, led by figures like the Maggid of Mezerich, really institutionalized his teachings.
Eventually forming the massive Hasidic dynasties we see today.
Okay, so we've mapped the historical friction. We see the desperation, the open-source rebellion, and the fierce pushback.
Right.
But to truly understand how this system operates, we have to look under the hood at the core theological engine that made all of this possible.
Because you can't just tell an impoverished, illiterate blacksmith that he's a spiritual giant without providing a totally new framework for how reality operates.
Exactly. You need a theology that justifies the elevation of the mundane.
And the Hasidic masters found that justification in a central, radical interpretation of divine presence.
The foundational concept, drawn from their Kabbalistic roots, is summarized in the Hebrew phrase, Ein od milvado.
Meaning, there is nothing besides him.
It sounds like a simple statement of monotheism, honestly.
It does, but in the Hasidic framework, it's a statement of absolute, radical divine immanence.
So God is not simply a king sitting on a faraway throne in some distant heaven, managing the universe by remote control.
No, God is the actual fabric of reality.
The divine presence is literally infused into every single atom of the material world.
The world isn't just created by God. The world is constantly, in every millisecond, being animated by the divine will.
Oh, wow. So if God withdrew that animating energy for even a fraction of a second, the universe wouldn't just crumble, it would cease to have ever existed.
Therefore, there is literally nothing besides him because the material world is just a physical garment concealing a spiritual reality.
So what does this all mean for daily life? Does this mean that even something entirely mundane like eating a sandwich or going to work becomes a sacred act if done with the right intention?
Yes, that's exactly what it means. And if we specifically connect this back to your notes, the listener links this concept to the wisdom onion model.
Ah, right, the idea of sitting comfortably inside a paradox.
Exactly. Because this theology flattens the hierarchy of actions, but it elevates the burden of intention.
How so?
The sources explain this through the concept of the divine sparks. According to this mystical cosmology, the physical world is broken and fragmented.
But scattered throughout this broken physical realm are hidden sparks of divine light, trapped inside material objects.
Trapped in the wood, trapped in the food, trapped in the physical labor.
And the entire purpose of human existence, according to this worldview, is to engage in tikkun.
The repair of creation.
A human being is stationed in the physical world to find those hidden sparks, extract them from their material shell, and elevate them back to their divine source.
So it all comes down to the mechanism of human intention.
Like if I eat a bowl of soup, just because I'm a biological organism experiencing hunger, it remains a purely physical, mundane act.
The spark stays trapped.
Right. But if I eat that soup with the conscious, directed intention of giving my body the vital energy it needs to perform a kind act, or to pray, or to help my neighbor,
You have fundamentally altered the cosmic nature of that soup. You've liberated the divine spark inside it.
that is wild. You turn a physical act into a conduit for the sacred.
And this is the brilliant, empowering mechanic of Hasidism.
Because the Mitnagdim believed you could only reach God through the intellect, through the study of the law.
But Hasidism argued that you can reach God through the physical world itself, provided you approach it with the right intentionality.
It transforms the entire landscape of human life. The tavern keeper pouring drinks, if he does it honestly and uses his wages to support his family, is performing an act of cosmic repair just as vital as the rabbi studying in the academy.
It is a staggering level of responsibility, though. I mean, if every action, every word, every meal has cosmic implications, the psychological weight of that could easily become paralyzing.
And this is where that wisdom onion model from your notes really shines. It's about learning to sit comfortably inside a paradox without forcing a logical resolution.
Because this Hasidic theology requires an almost superhuman ability to hold a paradox in your mind.
It demands that you hold two completely contradictory truths simultaneously.
Right. On one hand, God is infinite, transcendent, and completely beyond human comprehension.
On the other hand, God is intimately hidden inside the very physical objects you are interacting with right now.
Logic demands you pick one. Mysticism demands you hold both.
There is a classic Hasidic story in the research that perfectly illustrates the psychological tension of this worldview.
The one about the pockets.
Yes.
Yeah.
The teaching says that a person should navigate life carrying two slips of paper, one in each pocket.
In the right pocket, the note reads, "The world was created for me."
And in the left pocket, the note reads, "I am but dust and ashes."
The genius of that teaching lies in its refusal to offer a compromise.
Right, it doesn't tell you to find a lukewarm middle ground where you feel moderately important but somewhat humble.
No, it forces you to extreme poles.
The world was created for me is the ultimate expression of human dignity.
It means your actions matter on a cosmic scale.
If I'm the one meant to elevate the hidden sparks in my specific environment, then the entire architecture of the universe was designed so that I could be exactly here, right now, to do this specific work.
You are essential to the repair of the cosmos.
But the moment that cosmic importance threatens to become arrogance, you reach into the other pocket.
I am but dust and ashes.
You're entirely temporary, physically fragile and minuscule in the face of the infinite divine. You are nothing.
You sit inside the tension of the paradox, and the friction generated by holding those two massive, opposing truths is what creates the spiritual energy required to do the work.
Which brings us to perhaps the most challenging and surprising aspect of this entire system.
Joy.
Yes, if the everyday world is literally vibrating with hidden divine presence, and your job is to find it, the required psychological response to that reality is not silent, stoic meditation.
The required response is intense, ecstatic joy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Joy is treated not as a fleeting emotion, but as a religious duty, the absolute cornerstone of Hasidic practice.
The mandate is to serve God with joy. But it is vital that we understand exactly what they mean by joy, because they're not talking about a spontaneous good mood.
No, in this framework, joy is a rigorous, mandatory discipline.
It is.
But I have to push back slightly on this concept of mandated emotion. How do you treat joy as a discipline? Isn't forcing people to sing and dance contrary to genuine emotion?
It sounds like spiritual bypassing, right?
Yeah, exactly. In our modern psychological framework, we tend to view emotions as whether they just happen to us. If you're sad, you're sad. Telling a sad person they have a religious duty to be happy seems almost dystopian.
If we view emotion as passive weather, then yes, mandating joy is impossible and unhealthy. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the psychological framework detailed in the sources operates on a completely different mechanical understanding of the human mind.
Okay, break that down for me.
To understand why joy is mandated, we have to understand what the Hasidic masters considered to be the greatest threat to the human soul.
It wasn't sin, in the traditional sense of breaking a rule.
No, the ultimate danger was sadness.
The notes describe sadness, lethargy, and spiritual numbness as the precursors to total spiritual collapse.
Because sadness leads to despair, and despair is a declaration of disconnection.
If you believe in Einod Milvado, that God is everywhere and in everything, then falling into despair is essentially denying that reality.
It's a belief that you are alone in a cold, meaningless universe. Despair creates an impenetrable wall between you and the divine presence that is right in front of you.
So joy isn't just a pleasant feeling. Joy is a tactical weapon used to shatter the wall of despair.
Exactly. And the mechanics of this are tied to the Hasidic understanding of human nature.
The two inclinations.
Right. They believe humans are driven by two competing internal forces. The Yetzer Tov, which is the good inclination, the desire for selflessness and connection.
And the Yetzer Hara, which is the evil inclination, driven by physical appetite, ego, and self-centeredness.
But the goal isn't to obliterate the Yetzer Hara, is it?
No, this isn't an ascetic tradition where you starve yourself to kill your physical desires.
And that is a crucial distinction. The goal is transformation. The Yetzer Hara contains immense raw energy. If you destroy it, you lose the fuel.
The objective is to harness that self-centered energy and redirect it toward holiness.
And joy is the specific psychological state required to perform that alchemy. A depressed, lethargic person doesn't have the energy to transform their inner darkness.
But a joyful, ecstatic soul can elevate the physical desires and use them to serve God.
So if joy is a tactical requirement, how do they actually manufacture it? Because you still can't just flip a switch in your brain and declare yourself ecstatic.
You manufacture it through communal architecture. You build social technologies designed specifically to induce and sustain collective effervescence.
And the sources detail two primary methods for this, the tish and the nigun.
Let's break those down. The tish, which translates from Yiddish simply as table.
It's the central gathering of the community.
It's a highly ritualized event, right?
Yeah.
The community gathers around their leader, the Rebbe, but it's not a quiet lecture.
No, they share food, again, the elevation of the physical, and they sing. They sing intensely for hours.
And the music they sing are niganim, these soaring, wordless melodies. The choice to remove lyrics from the music is just fascinating to me.
Why is that?
Well, if you look at most religious traditions, the hymns are packed with theology and doctrine. Why strip the words away?
Because words are the tools of the intellect. Words create boundaries, definitions, and arguments.
Words belong to the elite scholars debating the Talmud.
Exactly. A nigun, because it lacks lyrics, bypasses the intellect entirely. It speaks a purely emotional language.
It allows the illiterate laborer to reach the exact same state of spiritual elevation as the scholar.
The repetition and the rising tempo of the wordless melody create a psychological state akin to trance or flow. It literally lifts the soul out of its despair.
It's a collective technology of the sacred. When thousands of people are shoulder to shoulder singing a wordless melody that builds in intensity over an hour, the individual ego dissolves.
The Yetzer Hara is swallowed by the collective joy.
But the entire structure of this joy, the tish, the community itself, revolves around a central access point. None of this functions without the leader.
The Rebbe, or as your notes use the specific Hasidic term, the Tzaddik.
The righteous one. This seems to be the defining structural feature of Hasidism. But the Rebbe is not just a rabbi in the conventional sense, is he?
No, he isn't just a teacher you hire to give sermons and answer legal questions.
How does the role differ?
The role of the Rebbe is perhaps the most difficult concept for an outsider to grasp because it blends extreme spiritual authority with intimate everyday involvement.
In the Hasidic worldview, the Tzaddik is a soul of extraordinary, elevated purity.
Because of his intense spiritual work, he acts as a literal channel between the heavenly realms and the physical world.
A cosmic conduit. The notes describe followers viewing the Rebbe as a spiritual father, a moral absolute, and the source of divine blessing for the community.
Which means the followers don't just consult him on theology. Because there is no separation between the mundane and the sacred, the Rebbe's guidance is sought on every facet of existence.
They ask him who they should marry, what business investments they should make, where they should live.
How they should handle medical decisions.
It's a total surrender of individual autonomy to the spiritual vision of the Rebbe.
It requires immense trust, and it provides immense psychological comfort.
In a chaotic, terrifying world, the follower believes that a holy man, directly connected to God, is personally looking out for their spiritual and physical well-being.
The Rebbe carries the burden of the community's souls.
But, to maintain that incredibly intense, insular ecosystem, an ecosystem entirely reliant on the authority of the Rebbe, the discipline of joy, and the belief that the outside world is filled with divine sparks, you cannot leave the gates of the castle open.
No, the outside winds of secularism, rationalism, and modernity would blow the fire out immediately.
Which is why the architecture of preservation is so absolute. The walls are not an accident, they are a vital survival strategy.
This brings us to the visual and cultural boundaries that define Hasidic communities today.
Right. I mean, it's a very common outsider misunderstanding. People assume Hasidic Jews are isolated and rigid. But from the inside, these boundaries are a deliberate strategy to protect their deep spiritual vitality from the diluting effects of secular culture.
When you see a Hasidic man walking down the street in Brooklyn or London or Jerusalem, the visual distinction is immediate.
The long black coats, the white shirts, the distinct fur hats called streimels, the side curls known as payot.
And the sources point out that this isn't a biblical uniform inherited from Moses.
No, the aesthetic is deliberately frozen in time. The clothing largely reflects the dress of the Eastern European nobility and Jewish communities from the 18th and 19th centuries.
The exact era and geography where the movement was born.
So why freeze the aesthetic? Why wear heavy 18th century wool and fur in the middle of a sweltering New York summer?
Because the clothing functions as a cognitive and social barrier. If you look completely different from the secular world around you, you can never unconsciously blend into it.
The uniform is a constant physical reminder of your distinct identity and your spiritual obligations.
It creates an immediate boundary between us and them, which prevents the slow, subtle creep of cultural assimilation.
It's a wearable fortress wall, and they reinforce that wall with language.
Yes, the sources note that while Hebrew is revered as the sacred language of prayer and study, Yiddish, the historical vernacular of Eastern European Jews, is fiercely maintained as the language of the street, the home, and daily life.
By maintaining Yiddish, you ensure that the community's media, its internal conversations, and its literature remain insulated from the mainstream culture.
You're filtering the outside world through a very specific linguistic and cultural lens.
This is where we need to look at the objective map of how Hasidism relates to the rest of the Jewish world. Because to the secular eye, all Orthodox religious groups might look vaguely similar.
But internally, the theological fault lines are massive.
The listener's notes provide a really helpful, entirely neutral breakdown of these distinctions, which is great because it lets us just report on the mechanics of these differences impartially.
Let's start with the closest neighbors on the theological spectrum. The non-Hasidic Orthodox, historically known as Lithuanian or Yeshivish Jews.
This goes back to the original conflict with the Mitnagdim, the Vilna Gaon's camp.
Exactly. Both Hasidim and Lithuanian Orthodox share the exact same foundation. Both believe the Torah is divine revelation, and both believe that traditional Jewish law halakha is absolute and binding.
They both observe the Sabbath strictly, keep kosher, and maintain traditional gender roles.
The difference lies entirely in the emphasis.
The mechanics of how to best serve God.
Correct. As the notes summarize, Lithuanian Orthodoxy remains fiercely dedicated to the intellect. The ultimate expression of piety is the rigorous, analytical study of the Talmud.
While Hasidism respects the law, but spiritualizes it, insisting that intense emotion, mystical joy, and attachment to a Rebbe are the true pathways to the divine.
It's the mind versus the heart, though both operate under the same strict legal code.
Okay, moving slightly further out, how do they view modern Orthodox Judaism?
Well, the sources outline that modern Orthodoxy also strictly adheres to halakha, but they employ a fundamentally different strategy regarding the outside world.
The modern Orthodox philosophy is integration.
Right. They believe you can fully participate in secular society, attending secular universities, working in mainstream secular professions alongside non-Jews, consuming secular culture while remaining strictly observant of Jewish law.
They believe secular knowledge can synthesize with religious truth.
And from the Hasidic perspective, that synthesis is a fatal error.
They believe that exposing yourself to secular philosophy, unfiltered media, and secular social norms will inevitably dilute the intensity of the religious fire.
They don't want to synthesize, they want to separate. The walls must remain up.
Moving further along the spectrum, the sources compare Hasidism to conservative Judaism.
And this is where the view of the law itself begins to fracture.
Right. The provided materials note that conservative Judaism maintains a strong commitment to tradition and Jewish law, but they view the law as something that organically evolves over time to meet new historical realities.
Because of this evolutionary view, conservative Judaism allows for adaptations that Orthodoxy rejects, such as mixed-gender seating in synagogues and the ordination of female rabbis.
From the Hasidic mechanical perspective, the law halakha is the literal source code of the universe, handed down by God at Sinai.
You cannot alter the source code to fit modern cultural preferences without crashing the cosmic software. They view these evolutionary changes as severe theological breaks.
Which brings us to the final comparison in the notes. Reform Judaism.
Reform Judaism takes a much more liberal, individualistic approach.
The sources state that the movement historically viewed the ethical teachings of Judaism as paramount, while treating the ritual laws like dietary restrictions or Sabbath rules as optional frameworks.
Frameworks that can be adapted or discarded based on individual conscience and modern rationalism.
The materials point out that Reform Judaism actively embraces modernity, championing full egalitarianism, including female and LGBTQ rabbinic leadership.
To the Hasidic mindset, which operates on the belief that every tiny specific ritual down to which you tie first has a direct mystical impact on the fabric of the universe.
The Reform approach of treating ritual law as optional or purely symbolic is essentially dismantling the entire mechanism of tikkun.
Hasidism believes it must maintain absolute continuity, the strict dress, the Yiddish, the unwavering adherence to ancient law.
All of it is designed to protect that internal fire of mystical connection from being diluted or altered by the passing fads of whatever century they happen to be living in.
And we must recognize that this instinct for extreme preservation wasn't just born out of a theological debate.
No, it was forged in the fires of unimaginable trauma. The walls are thick because the movement has survived multiple attempts at total annihilation.
The longevity of Hasidism is one of the most remarkable stories of survival in modern history.
We talked about the early opposition from the Mitnagdim. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they faced the massive cultural pressure of secular assimilation and the Enlightenment, which drew millions of Jews away from traditional observance.
But nothing compares to the absolute devastation of the Holocaust.
Historically, the vast, overwhelming majority of Hasidic Jews lived in Eastern Europe: Poland, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine.
The Holocaust systematically hunted and annihilated these communities.
The ghettos, the death camps, the firing squads, the destruction was nearly absolute. Entire dynasties, lineage lines tracing back centuries, were wiped off the face of the earth.
It's an evolutionary bottleneck of the most horrific kind. The vast forest of Hasidism was burned to the ground.
But the notes highlight that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the surviving leaders, the few rebbes who miraculously made it out of the camps or escaped the inferno, did something extraordinary.
They didn't succumb to the despair.
They gathered the shattered remnants of their followers, the widows and the orphans, and they rebuilt.
They relocated to entirely foreign environments. They built new centers in Brooklyn, New York, in Jerusalem and Bnei in Israel, in London, Antwerp, and Montreal.
They took the ashes of Eastern Europe and reconstructed the 18th century world in the middle of the 20th century metropolis.
And this evolutionary bottleneck produced a fascinating result.
It's like a massive family tree that was nearly chopped down, right? And the branches that grew back developed completely different coping mechanisms and personalities.
Exactly. The few branches that survived and regrew had to hyper-adapt to their new environments. And because they were led by different rebs with different philosophies, the resulting dynasties developed completely distinct personalities and survival mechanisms.
While outsiders might look at Hasidic Jews and see a monolith, internally, the diversity of thought, practice, and culture between the dynasties is massive.
Your notes specifically highlight three major groups to illustrate this divergence.
Let's start with arguably the most visible group globally, Chabad Lubavitch.
Chabad's adaptation to survival was to turn outward. Their philosophical framework focuses heavily on the intellectual understanding of mysticism.
The name Chabad is actually an acronym, isn't it?
Yes, for the intellectual faculties of the soul in Kabbalah. Chukma, which is wisdom, Bina, understanding, and Dat, knowledge.
But practically, they're known for their massive global outreach.
Right. While most Hasidic groups build walls to keep the world out, Chabad sends emissaries out into the world.
They operate centers in almost every country on earth, seeking out unaffiliated secular Jews to help them perform commandments.
They view this outreach as essential to gathering the final divine sparks needed to bring about the Messianic era.
They basically became spiritual first responders. But then you look at a dynasty like Satmar, and their adaptation strategy is the exact opposite.
Satmar represents the ultimate fortification strategy. Emerging from the ashes of Hungarian Hasidism under the leadership of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, their response to the trauma of the 20th century was to build the thickest, most impenetrable cultural armor possible.
They are fiercely insular, strictly policing their communities against secular influence.
And the notes also point out a very specific theological stance of Satmar, their intense anti-Zionism.
Which is often confusing to outsiders who assume all ultra-Orthodox Jews support the state of Israel. Why does Satmar oppose it?
The sources explain it's entirely based on theological mechanics. Satmar theology believes that the Jewish exile is a divine decree.
They believe there are ancient binding oaths that prohibit the Jewish people from using human political or military force to end the exile and establish a sovereign state before the arrival of the Messiah.
To them, creating a secular political state of Israel is a rebellion against God's timeline. So they maintain a strict separation, not just from the secular world, but from the secular Zionist state as well.
High, impenetrable walls. Now, for a third, completely different flavor, the sources mention Breslov.
Breslov's fascinating because they don't have a living Rebbe. Their founder, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, died in 1810, and they never appointed a successor.
They're known as the dead Hasidim by some other groups, right?
Yes, they are. And Rabbi Nachman's teachings are incredibly psychologically raw. He openly discussed his own bouts with severe depression.
Consequently, Breslov theology emphasizes intense emotional honesty, spontaneous joy, and a practice called hitbodedet,
where a person goes out into the forest or a secluded place to speak to God aloud in their native language, pouring out their deepest anxieties and brokenness.
They're the ones you often see dancing ecstatically in the streets, fighting despair with radical joy.
Do you have Shabbat, the intellectual outward networkers, Satmar, the fortified anti-Zionist preservationists, and Breslov, the ecstatic, emotionally vulnerable seekers?
They all share the same Baal Shem Tov DNA, but they adapted into entirely different species.
And looking at this incredibly structured, rebel-led, rule-bound ecosystem highlights a massive, subtle paradox that the notes explicitly ask us to consider.
The tension between radical individualism and absolute conformity.
Exactly. On one hand, the entire premise of Hasidism, the open source revolution, was about validating the individual soul.
The idea that you, specifically, have divine sparks that only you can elevate. It champions the unique, personal, heartfelt spiritual experience.
But on the other hand, the practical execution of this theology demands near total submission to the collective.
You must dress exactly like everyone else. You must follow a staggering array of communal laws. You must subjugate your personal decisions to the ultimate authority of the Rebbe.
This raises an important question. How does a human mind balance the belief that I am a totally unique cosmic actor with the reality of I must conform my entire physical existence to the dictates of this community?
It's the wisdom onion again. They don't resolve the tension, they use it.
The conformity provides the safe, structured container, and the individual mysticism provides the fire inside the container.
Without the container, the fire burns out of control and dissipates. Without the fire, the container is just an empty, dead shell of rules.
And clearly, this system, with all its intense demands, paradoxes, and high walls, possesses an incredibly powerful magnetism.
Because the sources note something truly fascinating. Despite the fortress mentality, outsiders occasionally opt in.
While active proselytizing to non-Jews is forbidden, and conversion into an ultra-Orthodox community is a grueling, multi-year process, people who are raised entirely secular do sometimes choose to cross the moat, learn the language, adopt the dress, and join the community.
Which forces a very confronting question for the modern secular world.
Why do they do it?
Exactly. If you're living a life with absolute personal freedom, where you can eat what you want, date who you want, live where you want, and consume whatever media you want, why on earth would you voluntarily surrender all of that to submit to a life of strict arranged marriages, archaic dress codes, and intense communal oversight?
Because freedom without purpose is often experienced as a vacuum.
That makes a lot of sense.
The sources outline that modern secular society, for all its material comforts and lack of restrictions, frequently fails to provide structured meaning. It lacks a cohesive narrative. It lacks transcendence.
You have endless choices, but no underlying reason to choose one thing over another. The paradox of choice leads to profound existential anxiety.
Hasidism offers the exact opposite. It offers a hyper-meaningful universe.
When a seeker enters this world, they're handed a clear, unshakable identity. They're embedded within an intensely tight-knit social support system where isolation is virtually impossible.
And they are given the architecture of meaning. Every single hour of the day is structured by ritual.
There's a specific blessing to say when you open your eyes, a specific way to wash your hands, a specific blessing for the water you drink, a rhythm to the calendar that dictates your focus.
For someone drowning in the chaotic sea of modern relativistic freedom, the appeal of a solid boat, a firm captain, and a clear map is immense.
The theology of Einod Milvado assures them that their life is not an accident. Even their suffering has cosmic utility.
And this brings us to the most poignant connection in your research. This directly links to the framework of the Tira subpersonality and the themes of the Tira's diary soundtrack.
This is where the historical mechanics we've been discussing intersect perfectly with the psychological landscape you provided.
In the notes, you highlight a foundational, staggeringly beautiful Hasidic teaching. The broken heart is the most whole.
In a secular framework, a broken heart, grief, trauma, doubt, existential loss is viewed as a malfunction. It's something to be medicated, fixed, or moved past as quickly as possible.
But in the Hasidic framework, mirroring the themes of loss and exile explored in Tyra's diary, suffering is not a spiritual failure.
Feeling broken does not mean God has abandoned you.
Because of the shattering of the cosmic vessels, the world is broken. Therefore, a broken heart is the most honest, accurate response to reality.
It's the starting point for genuine connection. The cracks in the heart are what allow the divine light to enter.
The feelings of exile and doubt are not erased. They are utilized. they are slowly transformed into the very engine of empathy, meaning, and empowerment.
The shattered pieces are exactly what you're meant to elevate.
That reframes the entire human experience. It tells the sufferer, your pain is not a glitch. It's the material you've been given to build something sacred.
It is the quiet wisdom hidden inside the sacred mystery.
We have covered an immense expanse of territory in this deep dive. Let's briefly retrace the architecture we've explored.
We began in the blood and mud of 18th century Eastern Europe, unpacking how the Baal Shem Tov launched an open-source rebellion against elite academic gatekeeping, democratizing mysticism for the traumatized masses.
We explored the radical theology of Ein Od Milvado and the divine sparks, discovering how the mundane acts of everyday life are transformed into cosmic mechanisms of repair tikkun.
We analyzed the rigorous tactical discipline of joy, understanding how the Yetzer Hara is elevated through the collective effervescence of the Tish, the trance of wordless Nigunim, and the absolute channeling authority of the Rebbe.
We mapped the fortress walls, the 18th century uniforms, and the Yiddish language, and objectively compared how Hasidism's unyielding view of divine law contrasts with the approaches of Lithuanian, modern Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Judaism.
We looked at the evolutionary bottleneck of the Holocaust, marveling at how survivors rebuild diverse, thriving dynasties like Chabad, Satmar, and Breslov, while maintaining the delicate tension between radical individual purpose and absolute collective conformity.
And we ended on the modern magnetism of the movement, how its offering of profound, structured meaning and its embrace of the broken heart provide a powerful antidote to the isolating freedom of the secular world.
It is an incredible journey. But before we close, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought.
Something that wasn't explicitly in the notes but builds directly upon the mechanics we've discussed today, specifically the concept of elevating divine sparks.
I'm always here for a lingering thought. Where are we taking this?
If the core innovation of Hasidism was the democratization of mysticism, teaching that an ordinary person, through the simple act of intentionality, can elevate the fragmented pieces of the physical world by finding the hidden divine sparks within them, what does that imply for the modern secular pursuit of information?
That is a fascinating angle.
Think about the very nature of this deep dive. You, the listener, provided a stack of scattered notes, disparate research, and varied concepts.
In our modern digital age, we're constantly bombarded by a shattered, fragmented reality of endless data, isolated facts, and disconnected media. It's kind of intellectual exile.
A modern shattering of the vessels.
Precisely.
Perhaps the very act of seeking deep knowledge, of rigorously sorting through the noise, holding the paradoxes of the wisdom onion, and searching for the underlying why connecting these disparate facts is its own secular form of everyday mysticism.
When you learn something deeply, when you connect a historical fact to a psychological truth, you are repairing the fragmentation of your own worldview.
You are, in a very real sense, gathering the scattered sparks of human wisdom to make the picture whole.
The pursuit of knowledge as an act of intellectual tikkun, repairing the world by understanding it. I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for providing such an incredibly rich, complex, and deeply human stack of research for today's deep dive.
It allowed us to truly step inside the fortress and understand the joyful, paradoxical fire burning in the courtyard.
Keep exploring the paradoxes, keep peeling the wisdom onion, and keep gathering those hidden sparks. Until next time.